So, thanks to a certain Kickstarter that recently broke the record for the most funded tabletop RPG of all time on the platform, I've been once again thinking about the design of D&D recently. More specifically, this time I've been thinking a lot about high-level play, or really more accurately, the lack thereof. See, there's a fairly common problem with the structure of D&D's level system. For those that aren't in the know, D&D has a fairly straightforward leveling system. You start typically at level 1, picking one of a dozen or so classes, and as you progress in levels, you gain new abilities from those classes. At level 3, you pick a subclass that helps tweak your class's abilities towards one particular flavor, and every 4 levels, you get feats, and so on and so forth. And this goes on from level 1 all the way up to level 20, or at least that's the idea. The reality is that very rarely do most campaigns actually reach that high of a level, and I think there's a few reasons for that. For one, the raw power level of high-tier play can just get kind of ridiculous to keep track of, especially when it comes to spellcasters. Sure, you can only cast a single level 9 spell per day, even at 20th level, but when those spells are things like Mass Polymorph that can turn 10 random people into gigantic T-Rexes, or summoning meteors out of the sky, or of course the infamous Wish spell, it becomes extremely difficult to balance any kind of encounter at that high of a level of play. But honestly, balancing combat arguably isn't even the biggest problem. Another reason why so few people tend to play games at this level is that it often just doesn't make any sense for the story being told. Now, sure, the exact level ranges that are plausible for normal people to achieve within any given setting can vary from table to table, but I think that it's at least generally accepted by a lot of people that, level 1 is you're basically just a random commoner with no special trait. By the time you get to level 5, this is harder to get to, but not outside the realm of possibility for a normal person to achieve. Somebody who might be like a highly trained professional, like the captain of a small town's guard, something like that. And by level 10, you're already reaching into the space of being powerful enough to be known across several lands and towns and cities as legendary adventurers, capable of slaying dragons and that sort of thing. And that's the thing. If you're running like a simple campaign whose scope is limited to like a single town or a small region of a map, then it's going to be increasingly implausible that all of these ludicrously powerful threats like a CR20 Draco Lich just keep popping out of the woodwork out of nowhere, because those are the kinds of threats that you need to challenge a party of that level. So unless you're running some kind of world-spanning or an extra-planar legendary adventure, it often just doesn't make sense to have your players even get to those higher levels, since you'll need to end up having equal threats to actually challenge them. And don't get me wrong, those kinds of games can be really fun if you do want to run that kind of game, but they're not for everyone, and just most people aren't going to be telling those kinds of stories at the table. But okay, for the sake of argument, let's say that you have some crazy awesome dungeon master who is willing to manage a campaign of that power level and everything that comes with it. The next issue is the fact that it simply just takes a huge amount of time to even get to those high levels in the first place. Let's say we are starting a fresh new D&D campaign at level 1, and your group plans on going the distance all the way to level 20. How long would it actually take to play a game to that point? Well, the Dungeon Master's Guide itself recommends that the first couple of levels you basically just speed through fairly quickly, only taking a single 4-hour session to level up from level 1 to level 2 and again to level 3. And then after that point, it recommends spending 2 to 3 sessions per level up, which honestly, in my opinion, seems fairly fast compared to how most tables run it, especially since a typical adventuring day is meant to have 6 to 8 resources resource spending encounters. And not all of those have to necessarily mean combat, but even if we assume that only, say, half of them are combat encounters, a single combat can easily take up an entire session by itself. At the very least, running multiple combats in one session is very difficult for a lot of groups. And I think that most quests that people run tend to span across multiple adventuring days before you get to level up again. But again, let's be kind and let's just estimate about 4 sessions per level. Both, I think, to reflect more accurately how more people play this game while still being fairly generous with the time frame. Although honestly, even this pace seems a little bit fast compared to a lot of the games I've seen. But if we start at level 1, quickly level up to level 3 after just a couple of weeks, assuming 1 session per week, and then we spend about a month at every level, because that's 4 sessions over the course of 4 weeks, then that means getting from level 3 to level 20 would take a minimum of 17 months, or about a year and a half of non-stop, weekly, 4-hour-long sessions to actually reach max level. And I mean, presumably you'd want to then keep playing for at least a few more sessions after that point, so you could actually use the abilities that you got from reaching level 20. No, don't get me wrong, I love the idea of playing in a single D&D campaign for that long. Hell, I've literally played in campaigns that have gone on longer than that. But nonetheless, actually maintaining a game for that long can be incredibly difficult for a lot of groups, because after all, the biggest enemy of Dungeons & Dragons is scheduling conflicts. People just no longer being able to play due to changes in their lives, wanting to try something new after playing the game for so long, or even just having trouble thinking of new story hooks to play if you're not using a module. You know, there's tons of reasons why it's difficult to maintain a single campaign for that long. And even if you do manage to have a really long campaign, you know, that estimation that I gave still feels fairly generous. I personally just wrapped up a campaign that was nearly 2 years long myself, and we only got to level 13, and I feel like that was a fairly typical pace for a lot of people. Sure, maybe we could have leveled up a little bit faster, but even then, we're not going to be reaching level 20 in that time frame. And this isn't just anecdotal. Consistently, over the years, there have been numerous polls that have revealed that most campaigns only last until around level 12 or 13 at the highest. Even Wizards of the Coast themselves put out data backing this up, revealing that around 90% of all active players on D&D Beyond are below level 10. Hell, even Baldur's Gate 3, the most popular D&D game basically ever, only goes up to level 12. Really, if you want to play high-level D&D, the only way to reliably do so is to just start the campaign already at high levels. And I mean, again, that can be fun, you know, starting at like level 15, already being legendary heroes, and then going on to like fight gods and stuff could be a total thrill ride. But at that point, you're basically just playing a completely different game. You know, if you're starting at level 15 using abilities that you almost never use in normal games, like it's like you have these two systems, one for like normal play and one for these like high level mythic adventures that are just kind of stapled together and very rarely actually interact with each other. So, like, honestly, like I said, high-level D&D play almost feels like it may as well just be an entirely different system. At the end of the day, though, D&D has just a ton of really cool high-level abilities. Whether you're talking about powerful spells that can twist reality to your whims, or really cool abilities like Artificers being able to throw out multiple turrets that they can command in a single bonus action, or monks being able to parry fire blasts with their bare hands. There's just a lot of cool things that you can play with at that level, but the vast majority of players will basically never get to actually use these cool powers if they ever do at all. You know, but okay, I have yapped about the problem for long enough. I think the real question worth asking at this point is, if you want to make your own RPG, or if you're just looking for other tabletop RPGs to play, how can you design around this problem or avoid it entirely, actually making higher levels of your classes and your game in general actually impactful for tables that might not actually reach them? Well, the first solution I can think of is to just kind of avoid the problem altogether with a less class-focused systems. There's a number of games like GURPS, for example, that just straight up doesn't have classes like Dungeons & Dragons does. Character advancement is a lot more freeform in these games, where instead of leveling up and gaining specific abilities in a certain order, you instead purchase new powers of your choice like you're at a store, spending experience kind of like money to get whatever abilities that appeal to you in that moment. Sure, more powerful abilities might cost more than a simpler one, so you're encouraged to maybe buy something in a specific order, but you're not necessarily required to wait until you reach some arbitrarily high level in order to get access to them. If you want to save up and get a high level power earlier than everyone else, you can just kind of do that, which also means that no matter what, you can theoretically get access to virtually any ability in the game fairly easily, which means you don't have to worry about this problem of hoping that you get to play all the way up until 15th level just to unlock that one power that you've never gotten to use before. When you play a game like GURPS, you can simply play with whatever powers you feel like buying for that campaign. If you don't get to use a power, well then in your next game you can try to go for that one instead, again, at whatever level you want without having to worry about trying to reach some arbitrary threshold. But there are other solutions to this problem than just throwing out classes altogether. There are some systems that still have classes or something that resembles classes, while still taking a more free-form approach as a kind of middle ground between this like GURPS and Dungeons & Dragons spectrum. A good example of this kind of design that I'm talking about is a system called Wrath and Glory, which is a Warhammer 40k RPG that lets you play as a wide variety of factions in the system, such as Space Marines and orcs, tech priests, Eldar, even basic guardsmen. So because of how wildly different these various factions are, you can't just take any ability in the game on any character. A tech priest isn't going to learn how to use any kind of orc-related powers or vice versa. So there needs to be a little bit more structure in what you're allowed to learn than there is in a game like GURPS. There are limits on what abilities you can take based on what kind of character you're playing. So you can kind of think of that as like your class. But within each of these archetypes, though, there are very few limits on what order you can learn the abilities in. So like, for example, if you're playing as a tech priest, then there's a whole bunch of generic talents that anybody can take, and then there are a bunch of tech priest specific talents that only tech priests can take. But, like GURPS, once you have the talents that you're allowed to take, you're basically allowed to take them in whatever order you want as soon as you have enough experience to purchase them. So, if you want to, say, rip out half your brain with the Rite of Pure Thought as the literal first ability you gain, you can do so, even though in most other 40k RPGs, that kind of tech priest power is usually a much higher level ability. And what makes this sort of design work is that a lot of these powers scale with the power of the character itself. So, for example, that Rite of Pure Thought power that I just mentioned, it makes you a lot harder to manipulate by replacing part of your brain with a computer, giving you a bonus to things like fear and resolve checks, among other things. But that bonus scales based on your character's rank, which you can effectively think of as your level for ease of simplicity. So, if you take this as your first ability in the campaign, well then that bonus will only be a +1. But over time, as you grow in power, the abilities that you have will also get more powerful, and that bonus will go from a +1 to a +2, or eventually a +3. This way, they don't have to worry about having overpowered abilities being too accessible at early levels. Those powerful abilities also don't need to be like prohibitively expensive or anything, because they're able to just simply make them scale, and vice versa. Weaker abilities don't have to get left behind and become useless once you reach higher levels. Basically, every ability in the game, or at least most of the more numeric-based ones, either scale with the character as they grow more powerful, or they give some more esoteric bonus. Doesn't really need a numeric modifier, but will still nonetheless be useful at basically any level. There's even a core mechanic that makes the game kind of interesting, where there's technically no limit to how many actions you can take on a single turn on combat. Like, normally you can only do one thing at a time without penalty, so that's like one attack or hacking one terminal or something like that. But if you want to make 17 attacks in one turn, technically you can do so, but the more actions that you declare on your turn at once, the bigger of a penalty you take. But what this means is that as characters naturally get more powerful and have bigger bonuses to their attacks or their hacking or whatever, then that means that they can afford to take more penalties and thus do more actions on their turn, again through a simple system that just scales as they level, instead of giving out higher level abilities at specific tiers in gameplay. So, thinking back to Dungeons & Dragons, if we were to try and apply this style of design to D&D, I could see it kind of working. Like, we could keep the basic class structure of having fighters and wizards and stuff that define what kinds of abilities you're allowed to purchase, but the classes could be designed to basically focus around having class-specific features that you can purchase in whatever order you want. Kind of like how the Battlemaster Fighter works, where it does have some abilities that it unlocks over time, but the main feature of the subclass is all about the combat maneuvers, and you can unlock those in whatever order you want, with just the number of maneuvers that you have access to and the amount, the size of the die that fuel them slowly growing over time as you level, not unlike how it works in Wrath and Glory. And I mean, I think this is one of the reasons why this particular subclass is so popular. It gives you access to so many styles of play because you don't have to worry about waiting until level 15 to unlock Commander's Strike or whatever. If you want to play a character based around that ability, you could unlock it as early as level 3, or even technically I think level 1 if with a certain fighting style, so that you could just get, whatever maneuvers fit your character. And so I could kind of see how we could maybe apply this style of design to the base classes themselves. Instead of having specific abilities that you unlock at specific levels, we could make it so that you have a pool of abilities, and every time you level, you get to choose a new ability from that pool. So like, if you're playing a monk, instead of having to wait until level 13 to unlock the ability to parry energy blasts, you could go for a more parry-focused build by purchasing the parry-related powers early and getting access to them much sooner. The trade-off being that you're, of course, sacrificing getting other powers in its place. This style of design, I think, could legitimately work if done well. But there is still one more design system that I've seen that solves this high-level problem really effectively, in my opinion. Let's say that you don't want the game to be so wide open like GURPS, letting people pick whatever abilities in whatever order they want. You still want a little bit more structure that you get from classes in your progression system, while still avoiding the high-level problems that I was talking about earlier. Well, there's still another system that you can use, which I personally call a micro-class system, simply because I haven't heard anyone else call them anything better. I know that there are other games that use systems like this, like I think that some of the Warhammer Fantasy TTRPGs do this, but naturally my personal favorite example of a system like this is the mecha tabletop RPG Lancer. In Lancer, since you're piloting giant robots, the progression system is based around acquiring the licenses to create and equip various kinds of new weaponry and gear that you get to attach to your own personal mecha. And this is structured in such a way where you can kind of think of each license as its own mini class. Every time you level up, you gain the ability to increase your rank in any of the game's dozens of different licenses by 1. So if you say pick the Nelson license, well then you only get rank 1 from that license, which unlocks you the Warpike and the Bulwark mod system. But when you level up again, you can either gain the first rank in a new license like the Lancaster or something, or you can acquire the next rank in a license that you already have at least 1 rank in. So if you picked Nelson again, then you unlock the second rank of the Nelson's license, which gets you the thermal charge, the armor lock plating, and the Nelson frame itself. And of course, you can do this a third time to unlock the rest of the license's equipment. So, at its core, this is structured very similarly to a normal leveling system. You gain levels over time, which unlock new weapons and abilities, just like you would in Dungeons and Dragons. But the main difference is the fact that every class in Lancer only maxes out at level 3. Once you get that third rank in any of the game's licenses, there's nothing else that license can give you. But the level cap in Lancer is 12. So what happens when you hit level 4? Well, you're simply forced to start leveling up a different license in addition to your first one. So in our example from earlier, once we hit rank 3 in Nelson, we've gotten everything we can get out of the Nelson's license. So maybe when we hit level 4, we start looking at complementary mech licenses, like the Metal Mark license, and then we start taking ranks in that, and then we can start mixing and matching abilities and weapons and whatnot between these two licenses in addition to the basic equipment on our own mecha to really customize it and tailor it to our heart's desire. And I think that is also really the strength of a microclass system like this. Not only do you guarantee that a player can theoretically access any ability in the game by only level 3, but it also allows for a lot more customization through the power of combinatorics. Like, D&D has multi-classing, sure, but it is designed in such a way where you're forced to sacrifice your progression in one class in order to gain the powers of another. Once you start multi-classing, you cannot max out either of the classes that you have levels in. Whereas in games like Lancer, you can fully combine all of the features of multiple microclasses together. The base book alone has around 24 different mech licenses, which means that by level 6, when a character can theoretically max out 2 different licenses entirely, that's already hundreds of possible combinations that you can use to make totally unique custom builds with, without having to actually design hundreds of different classes to play. And again, like I mentioned in a prior section, the game still allows you to have that power fantasy at higher levels by simply letting things scale as you get stronger through leveling. There is still vertical progression that goes beyond what the classes themselves provide. Over time, your weapons naturally become more accurate, which allows you to get critical hits more often in this particular game. And in turn, you can activate powerful effects more consistently. And certain weapons have limitations normally at the start, like the Asura NHP, which has a very limited number of uses before you have to restock during a full repair. But as you level up, you can increase the number of uses that these kinds of systems have so that they get stronger even after you've maxed out the license. Not to mention just generally increasing your mech stats, like its speed or health pool and whatnot. But yeah, to refocus this video back on the design of Dungeons & Dragons itself, having discussed all of these alternative progression systems, if Wizards came up to me tomorrow and asked me personally to design 6th edition from the ground up, what would I change about the leveling system based off of everything we've talked about today? Well, as much as I enjoy more freeform systems like GURPS, I do think that those games are a bit too open-ended to still maintain the core vibe of D&D. The classes are just a little bit too iconic at this point to haphazardly throw them out entirely. It just doesn't really feel like it would be D&D anymore if you don't have your classic barbarians and wizards and stuff. And I did already talk about how you could still have classes but with a more freeform ability picking system like with Wrath and Glory, but I think I'm leaning closer towards a more micro-class style system, though going as extreme as Lancer does with its classes only having 3 levels each is also a bit much. Honestly, I think we only need to reduce the level cap for each class to around 10 or so to accomplish what I want to do. By setting the cap for the level of each class to 10, that seems to fit how most people play the game based off of the statistics that we gathered earlier, with the vast majority of campaigns ending not long after reaching that level anyway. So now, based off of the average progression, most campaigns will actually get to use all of your class's abilities, including their capstones, before you reach the final session of your game. And to be clear, the overall level cap would still still be 20. So it would still work kind of like how Lancer does, where if you play a game past level 10 and you max out your first class, well then you just have to start leveling in a second class to keep progressing past that point, with things like your proficiency bonus and whatnot continuing to scale up accordingly as you gain more levels. And in turn, I'd probably also allow certain things like extra attack to stack for martial classes so that they could keep improving their attack progression and whatnot past level 10 as well. And most of the rest of the class features would naturally get compressed down to fit this new leveling scheme, although we could probably keep things like spell progression mostly the same, so that like by level 10 a wizard would still be casting 5th level spells, since spells already kind of progress at an alarming rate in my opinion. But I would focus higher level spell casting past level 10 to make it more about upcasting lower level spells rather than gaining entirely new spells. So for example, if a spell like Meteor Swarm were to still exist in the system, then we could start out with a weaker version of it that you can cast at 5th level, and then like if you upcast it to 6th or 7th or whatever level you want, then you start adding more meteors, you make them bigger and so on. Plus in general, I like the idea of upcasting options that do more than just increase the damage numbers. Things like increasing the spell's range, or its size of the AoE, or even unlocking new abilities and options to pick from with the spells seem way more interesting of a way to handle spell and upcasting progression than just making the numbers get bigger. And I think that would still allow us to have powerful high-level spells while not locking out those spells entirely from mid-tier play. Though I'm not sure exactly how we would scale certain spells like Wish, for example, as like the worst case scenario, but if anything warrants being locked behind high level play, it's probably the Wish spell, so I guess maybe that's a discussion for another day. But yeah, as for the more typical class abilities, I think that we could basically just compress down and give out those abilities at a much faster rate to match this 10-level progression that I'm working with here. This was one of my biggest complaints about 5.5 after all, with the rate that certain abilities, especially for martial classes, get handed out at way too high of a level for them to be relevant. You know, for example, take the Barbarian ability Brutal Strike. I personally really like this feature. It gives barbarians some much needed battlefield control, with the ability to either knock enemies away from your allies or to hamper their movement, which helps make them fill the role of a proper frontline tank that can draw aggro and protect their allies. And there's no usage limits either, so it gives them a tactical option that they can theoretically use every turn of combat. It's a great ability, but the problem I have with it is that you only unlock it at level 9, and the upgrades don't come until levels 13 and 17, which means that based off of the data that we got earlier about most campaigns ending around level 10, that means the vast majority of players are only barely getting to touch the basic version of this ability near the very end of their campaign, and they won't ever really get to use the more powerful versions at all. So moving these kinds of abilities down to lower levels, like maybe instead of level 9 you unlock Brutal Strike at level 5 alongside extra attack, since it only works on one of your attacks anyways, and then the upgrades could come at levels 8 and 10 alongside the capstone. You know, something like that would help make these kinds of powers more accessible to more types of games while fitting inside this new level scheme. Obviously, I am kind of oversimplifying things a little bit. You know, reworking every single class to give out all of its core abilities by level 10 would be no small amount of effort, and there would almost certainly need to be at least some cuts and reworks to how these abilities work in the first place, especially if we start adding subclasses into the mix on top of that. Though, I guess if you really want to see me go through a whole series of what I would do to rewrite all of the core D&D classes to work at this 10-level pace, maybe I could turn that into a proper series at some point in the future. But you'll have to tell me that you're interested in seeing that down in the comments. And speaking of, as always, I'm happy to continue the conversation in the comment section down below. I am curious to see if your experience lines up with the data I collected earlier, like how many D&D campaigns, or really campaigns of any sort of D20 adjacent system, have you played that actually goes past the mid levels of like 10 to 13 or so, and actually uses all of the abilities that you can theoretically access at high-level play. And of course, I am interested in hearing your thoughts on how these other systems treat their own progression systems differently compared to D&D, and if you think that these ideas are better or worse or not. But for now, if you like the video, make sure to leave me a like and hit that subscribe button if you want to see more content like this in the future. Thank you all for watching, and I hope to see you all in the next one.